North Atlantic, south of Iceland, 27 August 1941. The wind knifed across the conning tower of UA 570, turning every breath into a white ghost in the air. Steel plates shuddered under his boots as Kapitänleutnant Hans-Joachim Rahmlow stared up into a low, gray sky, his gloved hands trembling on the cold rim of the hatch. Above, a single RAF Hudson bomber circled like a patient hawk, its engines a constant growl that vibrated in his chest. Moments earlier, 4 depth charges had exploded so close that the UI boat rolled onto her side and the lights went out, throwing men and tools across the compartments. In the dark, there had been a hiss of escaping air, the stench of acid, and a thin, throat-cloring hint of chlorine from cracked battery jars, and someone had screamed that the boat was filling with poison. Now the submarine sat half awash on the surface, low in the water, engines silent, bow rising and falling in the heavy World War II swell. Spray slapped his face. The taste was iron and salt. On deck, his men huddled against the conning tower, some still seasick, some bleeding from machine gun splinters, all staring at him with the wide eyes of boys who had discovered that war was not a poster, but a cold, shaking reality. The Hudson roared past again, low and fast, bullets stitching the water around the hull, clanging against the casing. The anti-aircraft gun would not fire. The mechanism had jammed in the first panic, and now they were helpless on the open sea. In his inside pocket lay a small booklet of battle instructions that said a U-boat must never fall into enemy hands. In his nostrils was the faint chemical bite that told him one mistake might turn the entire hull into a gas chamber. A square of white cardboard appeared at his side, pushed up from the control room by some unseen hand. His fingers closed around it. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to a close-up of those fingers, knuckles raw, nails dirty, gripping that white shape as if it weighed more than the Atlantic itself. He lifted it high over his head. The bomber banked, the sea roared, and Germany's newest Type VIIC U-boat, pride of Nazi Germany's Atlantic fleet, signaled surrender to a single aircraft. Far away, unseen in the mist and spindrift, a small shape was already plowing toward them. An armed trawler that had once been a quiet fishing boat, crewed by men who knew nets better than guns. Rahmlow did not yet know that this moment would destroy more than a submarine. He did not know that one man would die because of what he was doing now, and that he himself would never explain it. If a camera could freeze here mid a gesture, what hidden orders, what fears, what secret guilt would it find behind that raised white square? Years earlier, the sea had been different to him. Not a battlefield of WW2, not a chessboard of convoys and wolf packs, but a wide, cold horizon where a young officer of the Reichsmarine learned to read wind and swell like a second language. He had grown up between 2 German wars, too young for the trenches of the First World War, just old enough to hear the stories whispered at kitchen tables about hunger, humiliation, and the lost ships of the Kaiser's navy. His father had been a harbor clerk, not a hero. But the old man's pride had lived in faded photographs of cruisers and battleships, in stories of discipline and duty under the imperial flag. For Hans-Joachim, those stories became a doorway. He joined the Navy in the uneasy peace between wars, when the uniform still meant honor and a steady wage more than it meant ideology. Then came Hitler, Nazi Germany, and a new promise. The oceans would again echo with German engines. Submarines under Seeboot were the cutting edge of this dream. Metal sharks meant to choke British trade and force the Allies to their knees. A U-boat, he told his family proudly, could sink a ship with a single torpedo. A self-propelled underwater missile with a warhead big enough to tear the spine out of a freighter. But his path was slower, stranger. While other officers went straight to combat in the North Atlantic, he spent years on an older training boat in the Baltic, drilling recruits who would go to glory or to the bottom before he ever saw a real battle. He watched younger men leapfrog past him, gain decorations, become names whispered with respect in the growing legend of U-boat aces. Some said he had been sent to a naval hospital once, for exhaustion, for nerves, for something that looked too much like doubt in a navy that worshipped iron will. He never spoke of it. He only worked longer hours, corrected more charts, stayed up later over tactical problems until the lines on his face became as permanent as the creases in his uniform. When the war widened, Poland, France, the Battle of Britain, even the distant Pacific War, he remained in the shadow world of training and routine patrols. The Eastern Front burned with tanks and artillery. Newspapers spoke of Stalingrad and Kiev, but in his world, the real front was tonnage sunk, convoys attacked, warships dodged in the dark. At last, in 1941, he received his own command. UA-570, a fresh Type VIII submarine, compact, deadly. With 4 bow torpedo tubes, 1 stern tube, and a deck gun for finishing wounded ships. A masterpiece of German engineering, the experts said. Narrow and cramped but strong enough, in theory, to dive deep beyond the reach of most depth charges. Yet as he walked her passageways for the first time, feeling the sweat and oil and metal close around him, a single question cut through the pride. Was he ready to lead boys into a kind of war he had only taught, never lived? And if the sea ever forced him to choose between duty and the lives staring back at him in those crowded bunks, which side of himself would rise from the depths? They were a strange crew, these 40-odd men of UA-570. Only a handful had ever seen combat. Most were fresh from schools and shore stations, drawn by posters that turned World War II into adventure. In the tight steel tube, they smelled of sweat, tobacco, machine oil, and the sour tang of seasickness that never quite left the air. Oberleutnant Bernhard Berndt, the executive officer, was younger than his captain, but carried responsibility like a weight he could not set down. He checked every valve, every chart, every line in the logbook with a neat, careful hand. He had grown up in a Protestant family that believed in obedience and quiet courage. Now, he found himself second in command of a weapon, designed to kill unnoticed, from below. He watched the men closely. The radio man who spoke softly of a fiancée in Hamburg and kept her photograph folded in his prayer book. The machinist whose fingers danced over diesel engines as if they were musical instruments. The boy who lied about his age to volunteer, still with a soft, almost childlike face when the red battle lamps turned on. Overhead, the Bay of Biscay and the North Atlantic became one long, rolling motion. When the sea rose, the boat behaved like a pendulum, and stomachs followed. Half the crew were violently seasick on the first days out of Trondheim, their early meals going into buckets instead of bellies, their strength and confidence leaking away with every lurch. Rahmlow watched Berndt steady them with quiet words, careful routines, small kindnesses, a hand on a shoulder during a violent swell, a joke at his own expense to break the humiliation of another man's sickness. He saw, in his XO, a kind of moral spine that he both admired and quietly feared. The submarine herself did not care. She hummed and vibrated, a closed world of gauges, pipes, bunks stacked 3 high, and torpedoes nestled like sleeping predators in their tubes. In the control room, depth gauges and trim indicators glowed dimly, showing how many meters of cold black water lay above their heads when they dived. Remember, Rahmlow had told them before sailing, "Our duty is clear. We hunt the convoys, we obey orders, we do not fall into enemy hands." At the time, the words had sounded hard and simple. Now, as the days grew rougher and the men grew paler, even Berndt wondered privately what those orders would mean when metal buckled and lungs ached for air. Outside, the sea held its secrets. Convoys moved along plotted routes, guarded by escorts, supported by the vast industrial might of the Allies. U-boats were the silent hunters in this military history, the forgotten soldiers beneath the waves, rarely seen, often lost without a trace. In such a war, who would remember an inexperienced crew on its first patrol? And if history did remember them, would it be for courage, for failure, or for something much more complicated than either word could hold? While UA-570 slipped out from Nazi-occupied Norway, another vessel moved through the same war on very different terms. Her lines were those of a fishing boat. her steel hull weathered by years of hauling nets in cold northern seas long before World War II began. She had once been a pure civilian trawler, crewed by men whose main enemies were storms and bad catches. Now she wore a new name and a thin skin of war. Requisitioned by the Royal Navy and reclassified as an armed trawler, she carried a small gun on her bow, depth charges on her stern, and a crew of reservists and former fishermen in dark blue uniforms. On paper, she was HMT Northern Chief, a modest piece in the great Allied anti-submarine net stretched across the North Atlantic. Lieutenant N.L. Knight, her skipper, had not grown up dreaming of military glory. He had known tides and markets, the weight of fish in the hold, and the fear of coming home with nothing. When war came, he took his skills knowledge of currents, winds, and the moods of the North Atlantic and brought them to the service of the Royal Navy. His gun crew drilled, but their hearts were not like those of destroyer sailors. They swore in the accents of coastal towns, talked of families left ashore, and complained about the cold that never left their bones. They knew that somewhere under the waves, U-boats hunted the ships that fed their islands, and that some of those submarines had already killed friends and cousins on merchant steamers. On the chart in Northern Chief's wheelhouse, the world narrowed to bearings, fixes, and patrol squares. The Battle of the Atlantic was a vast struggle convoys from North America, escorts, wolf packs, but here it boiled down to long days of gray horizon, radar blips, occasional alarms, and more often, nothing. The Eastern Front and the Pacific War made the headlines. Men like Knight fought in footnotes. One raw August day in 1941, a message crackled over the wireless. An RAF Hudson had forced a German U-boat to the surface south of Iceland, and the enemy captain had shown signs of surrender. Surface ships were needed to take possession before she could escape or be scuttled. Knight studied the signal, the coordinates, the estimated distance. His ship was small, slower than a destroyer, and the sea was already growing rough. Yet the order was clear. Close the position, be ready to accept the surrender, or, if necessary, to finish what the aircraft had begun. He looked at his crew, men whose hands were more used to hauling lines than manning guns. "How does a fishing boat take a submarine, lads?" he asked with a tight grin. No one knew the answer yet, but somewhere ahead, under that same low sky, a German captain was about to make a choice that would throw these very different worlds into a single, fateful encounter. When a small ship meets a powerful enemy, what truly decides the outcome? Tonnage, weapons, or the hearts of the men on each side of the waves? "You have 570 left Lofjord, near Trondheim, on 24 August 1941, sliding out past dark cliffs and into the open swell under orders to patrol south of Iceland." Her mission was simple in words. Locate Allied convoys and strike, adding to the silent tonnage war that defined the Battle of the Atlantic in WW2. The reality was a constant rhythm of dive days, surface nights, and the never-ending effort to keep men and machine working as one. Inside, the air was warm and damp when submerged, heavy with diesel fumes when running on the surface. Condensation beaded on every metal surface. The smell of unwashed bodies thickened by the hour. At periscope depth, the world shrank to the green glow of instruments and the thin vertical line of the attack periscope cutting through dark water. The crew still made mistakes. A plainsman let the bow rise too high. The boat broached slightly, then slid back under, leaving Rahmlow's heart hammering and his temper raw. A petty officer forgot a minor valve sequence and seawater poured where it should not, costing precious hours to clean and dry. Above them, unseen, RAF Coastal Command aircraft prowled on patrol, their Hudson bombers using ASV radar primitive but deadly to find contacts on the surface. The Germans had no radar warning. Only eyes and ears could save them from the sudden appearance of a silhouette against the clouds. On 27 August, after days of rough seas and seasickness, Rahmlow ordered the boat to remain submerged through the morning to rest his crew. The pressure hull was quiet. Most men off watch, lying in their bunks, listening to the distant hum of electric motors and the soft rush of water past the hull. For a few hours, it almost felt like a ship in peacetime transit. No alarms, no explosions, only the pulse of the ocean outside. But war does not respect tired nerves. When UA-570 rose again, trimming for a routine surface run to charge batteries, she broke through the waves almost directly beneath an approaching Hudson. The pilot saw a dark conning tower push out of the sea. Down below, the lookouts either did not look high enough or did not look fast enough. Metal clanged as the hatch opened, cold air poured in, and for a brief second, the sky seemed empty. Then the engines of the bomber howled closer in a steep dive. "Aircraft!" someone shouted, too late. Orders overlapped. "Crash dive!" "Flood tanks!" as men scrambled down the ladder, hands slick on the rungs. 4 depth charges fell into the water around them, each a steel cylinder packed with explosive, set to detonate at about 50 feet. The shock when they went off was like being struck by a giant hammer. The boat rolled, instruments shattered, fuses blew, battery jars cracked, and for an instant, it felt as if the entire world had snapped in two. They survived that impact, but something inside the crew had already begun to fracture. How long could an inexperienced boat dance at the edge of death before fear seeped deeper than steel? When the lights flickered back, they came on weak and uneven. Men groaned where they had fallen. Glass glittered on the deck plates, and a thin trickle of water ran from a cracked gauge into a growing puddle. Someone coughed, then coughed again, harder, eyes watering at a strange, acrid taste in the air. "Chlorine?" a voice whispered, and the word moved through the boat faster than any gas. Battery acid plus seawater could create a poisonous cloud. And every man aboard knew stories of submarines lost that way, men clawing at their throats in the dark. Reality was more complex. The leak was limited, the gas not yet lethal, but panic never waits for full information. Rahmlow forced the boat back to the surface, fearing that another depth charge pattern would crush them if they remained below. When the hatch opened, the air that poured in was cold and wet, but it felt like life itself after the hot chemical tang below. Men stumbled out onto the casing, blinking in harsh daylight. Above, the Hudson circled, having dropped its only set of depth charges. Its dorsal gunner fired short bursts, bullets pinging off the steel and sending up fountains of spray. 5 men were wounded, but the real damage was done inside their minds. They believed they were at the mercy of a fully armed enemy that could kill them at any moment. Down in the control room, codebooks and charts lay where they had fallen. The Enigma cipher machine, already known to the Allies from earlier captures, had been thrown overboard, along with many documents, in a flurry of emergency destruction. Yet other plans and technical manuals, the blueprints of the boat itself, still waited inside metal drawers and lockers, unknown even to some of the crew. The Hudson's radio operator tapped out a report. Enemy UA boat damaged and surfaced, apparently surrendering, standing by. In response, more aircraft were ordered to the area, and surface ships, including Northern Chief, were diverted toward the position. Hours passed. A relay of aircraft watched from above, ready to attack if the Germans tried to dive or flee, yet unable to stop them from throwing more items into the sea. Rain squalls moved through. Waves slapped the bow. Wounded men shivered under makeshift bandages. On the bridge, Rahmlow weighed choices that felt heavier with every minute. He could still attempt to dive, perhaps escape in the growing darkness, trusting that the boat's damage was not fatal. Or he could hold to the course he had already signaled, that raised White Square, and hope that the enemy would accept his surrender and spare his crew. Far away, in London and Reykjavik, intelligence officers were already planning how to seize the submarine, study her secrets, and use them against Nazi Germany in the long naval war. To them, UA-570 was no longer just a target. She was a prize, a living laboratory of German design and doctrine. Up above, to the watching Hudson crew, it looked simple. A UI boat too damaged to dive, caught and contained. Down below, in the cramped control room, the decision that would haunt a lifetime had not yet fully settled into final form. When fear, duty, and incomplete information collide in a few square meters of steel, which voice ends up speaking loudest? By evening, the sea had grown sharper, the wind cutting white scars across the waves. The men on UA 570 were exhausted, still ordered to stay on deck where the air was clean but the cold, merciless, huddled in the lee of the conning tower as the submarine rolled. Above them, now, a flying boat from 209 Squadron had taken over watch from the Hudson, its engines a distant, constant rumble as darkness crept in. Then, at 2050, a new shape emerged from the dusk. Northern Chief, her bow rising and falling, deck wet with spray, gun crew ready at their modest weapon. To the Germans, she looked small, almost fragile compared to the bulky submarine beneath their feet. To the fishermen as sailors aboard her, UA 570 looked like a steel monster from another world. Lieutenant Knight took his ship in close, loudhailer in hand. He had been briefed by radio. The enemy had indicated surrender, but a trapped crew might still choose to scuttle rather than be taken. With the wild sea and the rising wind, any sudden move by the Germans could doom both vessels. His voice boomed across the water in harsh, simple English, backed by the threat of his small gun. Do not scuttle, do not throw anything overboard, stay on deck, obey, or drown. It was not gentle, and not entirely in line with the Geneva Conventions, but in that moment, survival and capture mattered more than law. On UA 570's bridge, Rahmlow heard the words but not all their nuance. He saw the gun pointed his way, the spray, the unknown depth of damage to his own boat. He knew that if he ordered a dive and the hull failed, if chlorine gas filled the compartments, it would be his men who paid first. Berndt, still below part of the time, still moving between compartments, had his own thoughts. He knew the written orders. A UI boat must never fall intact into enemy hands, must be scuttled if capture seemed certain. But he also knew the pale faces he saw in every doorway, the youth of the crew, the fear, like a smell stronger than diesel. As Northern Chief circled, more Allied warships closed in. Old destroyers Niagara and Burwell, other armed trawlers, a tightening ring of steel and guns around the lone submarine. The balance of power, the great naval might of Nazi Germany against what had once been civilian boats and merchant escorts had flipped in a way few could have imagined when the war began. On the trawler, Knight's men watched silhouettes on the UI boat deck with a mix of hatred and grim curiosity. Some had lost relatives to torpedoes. Some had only heard stories of burning tankers and cold, oil-choked seas. Now, in a strange reversal, these feared hunters were standing in the open, shivering, under the guns of men who had once been simple fishermen. The first boarding would have to wait for better conditions and clear orders. For now, the night closed around them all. Aircraft above, trawlers and destroyers circling, and a captured submarine drifting toward a fate none of its builders had ever anticipated. In that uneasy darkness, did anyone on either side fully grasp how this small drama would ripple through history, courts, and memories long after the North Atlantic waves had erased all traces from the surface? By dawn, more ships ringed U 570. HMS Burwell, a former American destroyer, arrived and took overall command, signaling sharp orders to both the German crew and the smaller trawlers. The sea remained rough, making every attempt to pass lines or rafts a dangerous dance on breaking waves. From the UE boat came a message in halting English. "Will you take off our crew? We are sinking." From Burwell came the cold reply, "Blow main ballast tanks and send your crew below." When no action followed, suspicion grew that the Germans might be stalling, perhaps planning a last-minute scuttle. A warning shot from Burwell's machine gun spat across the deck, wounding more men and driving the crew below to operate valves at last. The submarine rose a little in the water as ballast and fuel tanks were blown. She was damaged, but not fatally. She could, naval experts later concluded, probably have escaped in the night if her captain had dared to trust the boat and his men. One by one, using rafts and lines passed by trawlers better able to maneuver in the heavy seas, the German crew were taken off. Officers first, wounded later, then the rest. Their faces were drawn, some defiant, some blank, some openly grateful to be leaving the heaving, claustrophobic hull behind. Berndt stepped off the submarine last among the officers, leaving his captain to the formalities with the British. Later, in Allied reports, the conclusion would be blunt. The surrender of U-570 had not been forced by fatal damage, but by panic and inexperience in the face of attack. To British and American analysts, this was an extraordinary stroke of luck. Not a sign of weakness in their enemy's steel, but in his human nerve. For the Germans, the story unfolded in darker tones. In POW camp in Britain, senior captured U-boat officers read of the surrender in newspapers and saw it as a stain on the honor code that bound their underwater service. They organized a secret council of honor to judge those responsible twisting ideas of courage and duty into a quiet courtroom of their own behind British wire. Rahmlow, still under interrogation elsewhere, was absent. Instead, the council focused on his executive officer, Bernhard Berndt, asking him why he had not seized command, defied his captain, and ordered the boat scuttled rather than let it fall intact to the Allies. He could find no answer that fit both reality and the rigid battle instructions they quoted at him. In the end, they declared him guilty of cowardice in the face of the enemy, a verdict unsupported by any real evidence, yet devastating in its implications. He would later die trying to escape, shot in the back by a British Home Guard patrol as he attempted a desperate, ill-planned mission to redeem himself by sabotaging the captured U-boat. The twist in this true story was cruel. The decision on that cold deck had been Rahmlow's, born of fear, confusion, and a mind scarred by earlier strain. Yet it was Berndt who became the scapegoat, the coward, whose death allowed others to preserve a more comfortable myth of unbroken U-boat honor. When a single raised white square can ripple outward to a secret trial, a man's death, and a legend twisted to protect pride, how much of war's truth ever makes it into the clean lines of official military history? While Berndt story ended in a quiet English woodland, the body of UA-570 lived on under another flag. After being towed toward Iceland, its journey interrupted by a mistaken attack from a Norwegian Allied aircraft that almost killed friend and foe alike, the submarine was beached, patched, and then refloated. Tugboats and escorts brought her into Wellfjord, where British and Allied specialists swarmed over her like surgeons around a rare patient. Technical teams measured, photographed, and documented everything: hull thickness, battery layout, torpedo room design, air systems, periscopes. They were impressed by the quality of workmanship, the efficiency of systems, the clever details that made German U-boats so dangerous in the Atlantic. Confidential reports concluded that the ship had been beautifully built and that the damage inflicted by the Hudson's depth charges had been serious but far from fatal. This capture, though not the first Allied look inside a U-boat, provided fresh, detailed insight into current German design and practice. It fed into the broader effort to improve Allied anti-submarine tactics, weapons, and training, contributing quietly to the long, grinding struggle that would eventually turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. In September 1941, the British commissioned the captured boat into the Royal Navy as HMS Graph, the only German submarine to see combat service on both sides in World War II. With a British crew aboard, she patrolled in the Bay of Biscay and other waters, hunting the very kind of U-boats she had once sailed beside. Men who had lost friends to torpedoes now lived and worked inside a German pressure hull, turning enemy steel into an Allied weapon. For naval historians, the irony was sharp. A single moment of surrender had given the Allies a working example of their enemy's most feared submarine type, plus training value and morale impact that no simple sinking could have matched. Nazi Germany's boast of unstoppable U-boats had been punctured in part by the decision of one flawed captain and the courage, or perhaps simple stubborn presence of a small-armed trawler and her civilian Seiler crew. Yet in the German record, the event was often buried under shame. The Eastern Front's vast tank battles and the Pacific War's great carrier clashes drew more attention than one U-boat handing itself over to vessels that had once hauled nets instead of depth charges. Only later would historians piece together how this small, true story fit into the larger pattern of World War II naval intelligence and Allied victory. When steel changes flags but memories refuse to cross the same line, Whose version of events becomes the one people remember? In the POW camp at Grisdale Hall, barbed wire and English rain framed a different kind of battlefield. Here, captured U-boat officers paced wooded paths under guard, replaying their patrols and losses in endless conversations and private nightmares. Honor, courage, and obedience were not abstract words. They were the code that gave meaning to the deaths of their crews and the risks they had taken beneath the sea. When news of UA-570's intact capture reached them, it felt like a slap in the face. How could a modern U-boat, undestroyed, under a sky with no enemy ships yet in gun range, have surrendered to an airplane and then to small trawlers? Men who had fought in hopeless conditions, sunk under depth-charge barrages, or gone down with their boats could not accept the idea without reshaping it. So they created the Council of Honor, a secret court to judge their fellow officer. Officially, such a court-martial among POWs was forbidden. Unofficially, their own Navy had laid down rules for exactly this kind of proceeding in a manual on maintaining honor. They saw themselves as guardians of a standard that Hitler's propaganda and the Kriegsmarine's traditions had set brutally high. But in their zeal, they looked past the full truth of the North Atlantic that day. They did not smell the faint chlorine, feel the hull rock like a toy under the shock of depth charges, or see boys vomiting from fear and seasickness while bullets spattered the casing. They sat instead in a wood-paneled room in captivity, asking perfect questions about imperfect moments. Rahmlow, whose mind and nerves had long been under strain, was kept away from their reach by British authorities once the trial's existence became known. He never had to sit before them and explain why his hand had risen with that white square, why he had chosen lives over a rule book written for cleaner circumstances than those the world had actually given him. Bernhard. He faced their questions. Why had he not arrested his captain, scuttled the boat, sacrificed the crew to keep technology out of enemy hands, and found that honest answers sounded like guilt in their ears? In the end, they condemned him. And he went to his death carrying a label that said more about their need for a simple villain than about his real courage or fear. In the years after World War II, some surviving officers would privately admit that the UA-570 affair had been more human, more complicated than they had allowed themselves to see at the time. But the damage to Berndt, to the full truth, to the quiet record of a frightened, unready crew, could not be undone. When stories of war are cleaned for honor, who speaks for the men caught in the dirty middle ground? Neither heroes in legend, nor cowards in fact. As the war moved on, 570 now HMS Graph served her purpose and then slipped into obscurity. By 1944, worn out by service and experiments, she was being used as a target for depth-charge trials, her once secret hull now just another tool in the Allies' growing arsenal. A storm and a parted tow line eventually drove her ashore on the coast of Scotland, where she broke up slowly under wind and spray. The great arcs of World War II history moved on without her. The Eastern Front chewed up armies by the million. The Pacific War ended in the blinding light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the Atlantic, improved radar, escort carriers, and better tactics finally broke the back of the U-boat campaign that had once seemed close to strangling Britain. For the civilians of Britain and Canada who had watched cousins die on merchant ships, the memory of one captured submarine mattered less than the relief of safer sea lanes. For the German families who received telegrams about sons missing in action on U-boat service, the name UA-570 was just one more number among many, and perhaps a source of quiet shame if they ever learned the details. Northern Chief and the other trawlers went back to mostly anonymous tasks once the war ended. Some returned to fishing, some were scrapped, their wartime guns removed, their decks once again smelling of fish instead of cordite. The men who had watched a German U-boat surrender to their small ship carried the memory home as a story told over pints in dim pubs, half believed by those who heard it. For decades, the strange episode appeared only in specialist books and naval journals. An odd footnote. UAF 570 surrendered after air attack and was captured intact, recommissioned as HMS Graph. It was a gift to intelligence, a curiosity in military history, but hardly the stuff of grand strategy debates or famous films. Yet, inside that brief line lay an ocean of human tension. Cold breath on a conning tower, trembling hands gripping a white square, a trawler's loudhailer cutting through wind, and a slow, invisible chain leading to a scapegoat's grave in a quiet English town. How many such small stories lie just beneath the surface of World War II, a vast sea of forgotten soldiers, fishermen turned sailors, and men who broke under pressures history rarely bothers to measure. Imagine now that the camera drifts back one last time to that crucial instant in the North Atlantic. Close-up. Rahmlow's face, pale with exhaustion and fear, eyes fixed not on glory or disgrace, but on the immediate question of whether his men will live to see another dawn. The white square in his hand trembles slightly in the wind, then rises, a fragile signal against the storm-gray sky. On Northern Chief's Bridge, Lieutenant Knight watches through binoculars, jaw tight. He does not see the future POW councils, the scapegoat's death, or the intelligence reports stamped top secret. He only sees an enemy choosing not to fight on this day. He gives orders to hold fire, to close in, to secure the surrender relief and suspicion mixed in equal measure in his chest. For a heartbeat, the great powers of World War II, Nazi Germany's U-boat arm, the Allies' naval and air forces, the convoys that kept an island nation alive narrow to this one fragile connection between a raised hand and a watching lens. The Eastern Front's gunfire and the Pacific War's distant carrier battles are, for this moment, only a distant echo behind the crash of the Atlantic swell. History would later call it a remarkable intelligence coup, a rare intact capture of an enemy submarine that helped the Allies refine their fight against the U-boat threat in WW2. German records, when they mentioned it at all, wrapped it in language of failure, cowardice, and dishonor, until even the truth of who had decided what became blurred behind anger and shame. But the sea remembers differently. It remembers steel and fear, decisions made in seconds under the weight of years, and the way a vessel that had been born to kill slipped instead into a second life under another flag. It remembers a fishing trawler turned warship, whose civilian-rooted crew found themselves, for one rough August night, holding the fate of a powerful enemy in their calloused hands. Long after the hull of UAF 570 divided by HMS Graph had rusted away on lonely rocks, the invisible wake of that surrender still ran through naval archives, family stories, and the quiet corners of military history. It asks a question that outlives any flag or uniform. When the moment comes and the world narrows to you, your fear, and the lives you hold in your hands, what will you choose, and how will those who never stood in your place dare to judge you?